Tonight, we're stepping into a different kind of romance. One that doesn't involve candlelit dinners or long walks on the beach. There's no diamond ring, no awkward proposal rehearsed in the mirror, no Pinterest board full of themed color palettes. Instead, there's a dirt path leading to a village church, two families whispering in corners about land and livestock, and a bride nervously twisting a sprig of rosemary between her fingers. This is the Middle Ages. And here, marriage isn't so much a celebration of love as it is a careful transaction. A contract sealed not always with a kiss, but with a signature, or a sack of grain. In the medieval world, marriage wasn't private. It wasn't personal. It was public, practical, and permanent. Something that bound not just two people, but two households, two fortunes, sometimes even two feuding manors. It could bring peace or start a war. It could elevate your social status or drag it through the mud. And once it was done, well, you better hope it worked out, because your options were limited and your priest had very little patience for regrets. So, if you've ever wondered what it was like to fall in love in a time when you didn't get to choose who you married, or when you did, but still had to ask your Lord his permission, then you're in the right place. Close your eyes, if they aren't already. Picture a village. One dirt road, a few stone cottages, smoke curling from low chimneys, chickens pecking at the ground, children running barefoot, and somewhere in the middle of it all, a young couple, maybe no older than 14, standing shoulder to shoulder, hands clasped not because they want to, but because everyone is watching. A man in a brown robe says a few words in Latin. There are no rings, just the touch of fingers. Maybe a loaf of bread is broken between them. Maybe they kiss. Maybe they don't. Either way, it's done. They're married now, and the rest of their lives begins right there, in a world where love might come later or not at all. We're going to walk with them through the negotiations, the feast, the whispered blessings, and not so subtle warnings. Through the sleepless wedding night, the daily work, the quiet moments, and the not so quiet ones. This isn't a fairy tale, but it is a story. And like most medieval stories, it's a mix of duty, faith, survival, and yes, a little bit of love, the kind that sneaks in through the back door when no one is looking. So dim the lights. Maybe pull the blanket a little tighter. Tonight, we're going to explore what it really meant to say, I do, when that meant forever. And when forever came with a dowry, a dozen chickens, and a whole lot of expectations. Let's begin. Long before anyone said vows or broke bread, there were meetings. Quiet conversations in kitchens, whispered exchanges behind chapel walls, nods exchanged over market stalls. Marriage didn't begin with love. It began with strategy. In medieval Europe, especially for those with land, wealth, or even just a small patch of inheritance to protect, marriage was a move on the great chessboard of survival. And every piece had value. A daughter might be worth a few acres of farmland or access to a fresh well. A son, possibly a claim to something larger, a title, an alliance, or a future seat at someone's long wooden table. The matchmakers weren't strangers hired from the next village. More often than not, they were the parents themselves, mothers watching the neighbor's son push a plow with sturdy hands, fathers calculating what kind of livestock might come with a girl whose dowry had been quietly growing. In noble circles, this job became even colder. Families exchanged letters instead of glances. Marriages were discussed in formal halls by people who had never seen the children they were binding together. For the families involved, marriage was protection. It was a way to knit households together before winter set in, before old age or famine could leave someone exposed. A daughter married off meant one less mouth to feed and one more link to another hearth. A son married meant heirs, crucial when life expectancy didn't stretch very far. And age? That was flexible, especially for girls. A marriage might be arranged when the bride-to-be was still learning to braid her own hair. The actual ceremony might wait until she reached a suitable age, but the decision was made early. A girl could be spoken for before she ever understood what being a wife truly meant. Consent wasn't always absent, just vague. A young woman might be asked her opinion, but it was often clear that the outcome was already settled. Saying yes was easier than defiance. Saying no was sometimes dangerous. And for the lower classes, where life was about staying fed and out of the weather, love was a luxury rarely afforded. Survival came first. It wasn't always cold-hearted. Some families did try to ensure compatibility. A hard-working daughter deserved a man who wouldn't waste her labor. A clever son was better matched with a wife who could manage a household. There were matches based on kindness, shared values, or simply geography. The girl next door often became the girl you married. But for nobles, royalty, and those wrapped in the church's tighter grasp, the stakes were higher. Marriage could be war by other means. Treaties were signed through ceremonies, borders redrawn with wedding rings. A young noble woman might be sent across a continent to marry a man she'd never met, in a court that spoke a language she didn't know. For her, marriage meant exile, a lifetime away from her mother tongue and the food of her childhood. And once a match was agreed upon, there was no backing out gracefully. Promises were binding. To renege on a betrothal could spark feuds, debts, or even accusations of spiritual crime. The church treated the spoken vow seriously, even if it was made in haste. A yes, whispered in a field, witnessed by one person, could be enough to doom you to a lifetime. Still, amid the alliances and the practicalities, there were rare sparks. Two young people might find they actually liked one another. A shared joke in the stable, a kind glance across the firelight. Not all medieval marriages were dry contracts. Some grew tender over time. Others bloomed unexpectedly, like wildflowers on the edge of a plowed field, unplanned but quietly welcome. But it all began here, with parents and priests, ledgers and land grants, with two families weighing each other's fortunes, risks, and expectations. Before love, before ceremony, there was a bargain. And in that exchange, lives were changed, often without the people most affected having much say in the matter at all. That was the start of most medieval marriages. Not with passion, but with planning. Not under stars, but over parchment. And once the deal was struck, the machinery of matrimony creaked into motion, ready or not. Marriage in the Middle Ages wasn't just a union of hearts or hands. It was an exchange, not just of vows, but of value. And whether whispered in thatched cottages or spoken beneath the stone arch of a noble estate, one question quietly shaped every match. What is she worth? It sounds cold, because it was. But it wasn't always cruel. In a time when life was often short, hard, and uncertain, families needed to protect what little they had. And marriage was one of the few tools they could use to trade, shield, or grow their standing in the world. The dowry, and sometimes the bride price, made that possible. For most girls, especially in farming villages or modest towns, a dowry was the price her family paid to help her start her new life. It might be small: a wool blanket, a cow, a chest of linens carefully stitched by her mother and sisters. If they were lucky, maybe a little silver. But even the humblest dowry was symbolic. It said, she's not arriving empty-handed. It wasn't charity. It was investment. Her family gave what they could to ensure she wouldn't be entirely dependent on her husband's goodwill. A little coin to buy bread if he fell ill. A spare pot or spoon, just in case his family offered none. In wealthier homes, the dowry might include land, servants, or even a written promise of inheritance. The richer the bride, the heavier the chest, and the higher the expectations. For nobles, dowries weren't simply about comfort. They were about power. A marriage might include promises of vineyards, toll rights, or whole swaths of countryside. Daughters in this world were bargaining chips, each one representing a deal waiting to be made. The more sons a noble had, the more land he needed to gain. The more daughters, the more land he risked losing. But not all regions followed the same customs. In some places, it wasn't the bride's family who paid. It was the groom's. A bride price. This wasn't exactly buying a wife, though it could feel that way. It was, at its core, a gesture of gratitude and compensation. We're taking your daughter from your household. Here's something for the loss. The bride price might be money. It might be livestock. It might be labor, offered in seasons of harvest or help during winter. In some communities, it was ceremonial, a token coin or a ritual offering, but the meaning lingered. Marriage had weight, and that weight could be measured. None of this meant brides were treated as goods on a shelf. In many homes, especially among the lower classes, these exchanges were humble and heartfelt. A father might pass down his only plow to help his daughter's new household succeed. A mother might tuck a handful of dried herbs into her daughter's wedding bundle, whispering old recipes she'd never write down. These gifts weren't just payments, they were hopes. But the system had sharp edges. A girl without a dowry, especially in towns or wealthier villages, might find herself unmarried far longer than her peers. Too poor to wed became a quiet sentence. And for those of noble blood, a daughter without a dowry was nearly invisible. An ornament left in the house too long, quietly resented. Worse still were the matches driven purely by the numbers. A wealthy man might marry a girl years younger, not for affection, but for her lands. A widow, twice her age, might be forced into a second marriage she didn't want, just to protect her late husband as property. Women, even those who managed to negotiate for themselves, often found their value measured in coin, not character. And yet, within these exchanges, a kind of agency could exist. Some women negotiated their dowries fiercely, insisting on certain items or protections. Some even ensured parts of the dowry would return to them if the marriage soured or ended in death. These weren't modern prenuptial agreements, but they were early echoes of a truth: security matters. By the time the marriage was set and the terms agreed upon, the chests would be packed. Everything she owned, from a comb carved by her uncle to the woven belt her sister dyed with onion skin, would be bundled carefully. She'd carry these things into a new life, surrounded by strangers, expected to make a home for what she'd been given. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't fair, but it was how the world worked for many centuries. Not with flowers and whispered proposals, but with ledgers and livestock and long, quiet negotiations. And so, the price of love, or at least of marriage, was counted in more than just affection. It was weighed out in coin, in goods, and in the quiet sacrifices families made behind closed doors. The wedding day in the Middle Ages didn't always look like a grand affair. There were no swirling ball gowns, no golden rings cut from jewelers' hands, and no soft orchestras behind linen veils. Instead, it was earthy, loud, sometimes chaotic, and deeply communal. Long before dawn, the household stirred. Not just the bride's family, but the entire village might sense it. Chickens clucked nervously from early footsteps. The baker's boy delivered loaves a little faster. Neighbors peeked through shutters. A wedding wasn't a private event. It was public, nearly ritualistic, and almost always a shared spectacle. The bride, often no older than 16, would be prepared by a chorus of women. Some were sisters, some were aunts. Some had just shown up, because they always did. Her dress wasn't white. White was a rarity, reserved for linens and saints. Instead, she might wear her best gown, often dyed with whatever color she or her family could afford. Faded green from nettles, deep blue from woad, rusty reds from madder root. It wasn't uniform, but it was hers. Sometimes she went barefoot, especially in the countryside, where shoes were expensive and feet were tough. Other times, she wore a garland of herbs in her hair. Rosemary for remembrance, lavender for luck. Superstition lingered in everything. Tucking an iron pin into her hem might keep the evil eye away. A whispered prayer from her grandmother could be worth more than a priest's blessing. The groom, likely stiff with nerves or just trying not to sweat through his tunic, didn't see her until the church steps or the village square, depending on what the family could afford. Church weddings were encouraged, especially after the 12th century, when the church began tightening its grip on marriage rights. But for many, the ceremony happened where it could, in front of a priest, in full view of others, and often right outside the chapel doors. Why outside? Because the moment wasn't fully sacred yet. The betrothal, the exchanging of promises, usually happened at the threshold, in full view of witnesses. Only after that would the pair walk inside to receive the priest's blessing, and, if they could afford it, a short mass. There were no "do you take this woman" speeches, no rehearsed vows. Instead, the couple might simply say, "I take you as mine," with hands joined, sometimes wrapped in a cloth, a symbolic binding. Afterwards, there was food, always food. It didn't matter how much or how fine. Bread was essential, ale was expected, and if a pig had been slaughtered, the whole village might feast for hours. Even poor weddings had to offer something: a crust of cheese, a shared pot of stew. Hunger was constant in medieval life, and a wedding was a break in that rhythm, a reason to eat, dance, and forget winter's bite. Music was never far. Fiddlers, pipers, or even a cousin who could thump rhythm on a barrel lid might lead the dance. Shoes kicked off, skirts lifted just enough to hop over stones, and laughter, deep from the belly, rolled through fields or halls. Children ran under tables. Elders nodded slowly, remembering their own weddings. And the newlyweds sat stiffly side by side, surrounded by noise they didn't quite know how to process. But not all wedding days were joyous. Some were laced with tension. A reluctant bride, a groom still bearing bruises from a rival's challenge, a dowry dispute that hadn't been entirely resolved. Sometimes family alliances were uneasy. A wedding might mean peace between neighbors, or the start of whispered feuds. There were customs, too, strange to modern ears. Guests might throw wheat at the couple, a symbol of fertility. Sometimes villagers escorted the pair to their marriage bed, not with privacy, but with noise, banging pots, singing bawdy songs, and offering crude advice. It was a mix of laughter and pressure, celebration and performance. And yet, for all its discomforts, the wedding day marked something irreversible. Whether the marriage had been arranged or chosen, whether love had bloomed or barely begun, a line had been crossed. Two lives, once separate, were now bound by law, by religion, and by the watchful eyes of everyone who mattered. When the music faded and the last crust of bread was gone, the bride and groom would slip away, sometimes to a borrowed room, sometimes to a wagon, if a journey lay ahead. And in that quiet, after the feast and before the real weight of marriage began, they'd share their first moment of uncertain peace. It wasn't always perfect, but in a world that often gave people few choices, that day, the laughter, the ritual, the noise lingered. The guests have gone quiet. The fires burn low. Bread crumbs lie forgotten on the trestle tables, and the echoes of laughter drift off into the dark. Now, in the hush that follows the noise, the newlyweds face what many considered the most important part of the marriage. Not the ceremony, not the feast, but the night that followed. In the Middle Ages, the wedding night wasn't always a private affair. Or rather, it didn't begin that way. In noble households, or even among wealthier townsfolk, it wasn't uncommon for the couple to be escorted to the marriage bed with a mix of ritual and raucousness. The bedding ceremony was as much performance as tradition. Guests would lead the bride and groom through the halls with songs, teasing jokes, and occasionally far too much wine. In some cases, family members stayed just long enough to watch the couple lie down, a strange blend of superstition and social enforcement. In more formal settings, witnesses might even be required to confirm that the marriage had been consummated, especially when property or bloodlines were involved. Proof of a completed union mattered deeply when inheritance was at stake. But behind the doors, once the noise faded and the laughter dwindled, things grew quieter and more complicated. For many couples, especially if they were young, this night wasn't about passion. It was about obligation, uncertainty, and a sense that something had to be done, whether either party understood it or not. Few received anything close to what we'd call proper education about the body. Knowledge was patchy, whispered, or entirely shaped by folklore and fear. Aunts might pass along advice laced with myth. Older brothers might offer crude warnings rather than guidance. The result? A wedding night that could be deeply awkward. Two people, often strangers just days before, were expected to become something more, quickly, quietly, and without complaint. In noble circles especially, pressure loomed large. A noble woman's value was often tied to her chastity, and later, her fertility. Failure to consummate the marriage could lead to annulment, scandal, or worse, political fallout. Conversely, the bride could be shamed, or even cast aside if she wasn't deemed intact. The proof? Sometimes a bloodied sheet, displayed the next day as brutal public confirmation. But in the countryside, things were different. There was still expectation, always, but perhaps less theater. A peasant couple might crawl into a straw-filled bed after hours of dancing and ale, the day's emotions leaving them more tired than thrilled. Their shared life would begin not with a spark, but with a sigh. In those quieter homes, sometimes affection grew in the dark. A shy hand reaching out, a whispered joke that cut through the tension. They might not have loved each other yet, but they were bound, and that bond, for better or worse, began to settle in like a weight around the shoulders. Not every wedding night was gentle. Some were marked by fear, especially when a bride was young or the groom unkind. In rare cases, consummation was delayed, out of illness, exhaustion, or hesitation, but such delays invited suspicion. People talked, and silence was rarely left alone for long. There were also stories, half remembered now, of herbs slipped into wine to calm nerves or dull senses, of charms tied beneath the bed to ensure fertility, of saints quietly invoked by new brides who wanted to bear sons or avoid pain. The wedding night was laced with expectation, not only from family but from heaven itself. Yet not all was grim. Some couples found tenderness in those first hours. Not love, perhaps, not yet, but an understanding, a shared glance in the candlelight, the comfort of a warm body beside you after months of uncertainty. In the dark, with no eyes watching, they began the long, slow task of becoming partners, even if they didn't have the words for it. As the candles burned low and the sounds outside fell to a hush, the wedding night passed. Some remembered it forever. Others forgot it quickly. But for nearly every married couple in the Middle Ages, it marked the threshold, the moment the ritual ended and real life began. And in the morning, the world moved on. Bread needed baking. Animals needed feeding. The romance faded, replaced by rhythm. But something had changed. Two separate lives had been tied together in one night, for better or worse, in the quiet space between expectation and reality. The wedding was done. The feast had faded. Now the real work began. For a woman in the Middle Ages, marriage wasn't a milestone to rest upon. It was the start of a new role, one heavy with expectations and often little thanks. She was now a wife, perhaps soon a mother, and the rhythm of her days shifted accordingly. Her world narrowed, but not in insignificance, rather in focus. While a husband might leave for the fields, for trade, or for war, she stayed close to the hearth, the center of the household, the keeper of warmth, food, cleanliness, and order. Each day began early. Before the sun cracked over thatched rooftops, before roosters had finished their calls, she'd rise, dress in wool or linen, bind her hair, and get to work. The fire had to be coaxed back to life. If bread needed baking, it started now. If water had to be drawn, it meant a walk to the well, often with aching arms and quiet determination. Marriage did not free her from labor. It changed the kind. Spinning wool, weaving cloth, brewing ale, tending a garden. Chickens clucked around her skirts, and children, if not her own, then someone's, wandered underfoot. She knew the value of each herb she grew, which plants healed and which poisoned. She patched tunics, scrubbed floors, kneaded dough. Her hands were never idle. In wealthier households, some of those tasks were delegated. Servants, or even enslaved workers in some regions, might carry out the more grueling work. But even noblewomen oversaw their domain with care. Managing a manor meant tracking stores, planning meals, arranging for guests, tending to tenants. A castle or villa might look grand, but behind those stone walls was a living, breathing ecosystem, and she was expected to keep it running smoothly. And yet, with all this labor, she rarely had voice in decisions beyond the door. Legally, she was her husband's responsibility. Her opinions carried little weight in court. Her rights were few. She couldn't own property independently unless widowed or protected by rare regional laws. She was expected to obey, to endure, and to preserve family honor above all. Still, she found ways to shape her world. Quiet influence was a survival skill. She might nudge her husband's choices over supper, or steer a dispute between neighbors with a few calm words. She built alliances through gossip, favors, and hospitality. Her strength didn't always look like power, but it held homes together. Women shared burdens with one another, too. They leaned on sisters, neighbors, midwives, old widows, with stories long as winters. Over laundry or in churchyards, advice passed in low voices. What to do when a child wouldn't nurse, how to soothe a fever, when to hold one's tongue. These threads of shared wisdom became their own kind of lifeline. Not every husband was cruel. Some were kind. Partnerships could grow from arranged roots, from duty into affection, from formality into quiet trust. A shared look across a crowded hall, a moment of understanding during hardship. These small gestures often meant more than words. They were signs that, in a life of constant demand, there could still be connection. But hardship was never far. Disease, famine, war, they could undo even the most stable household. A woman had to be adaptable. If her husband died, she might take over his trade, defend his land, raise his children alone. Some widows ran businesses, held properties, even advised lords, not because they were granted freedom, but because they seized what the gaps in law allowed. And through it all, her work was rarely recorded. Names were lost, stories erased. Yet in every stitch of cloth, every meal cooked, every child raised, her presence echoed. She was the unseen foundation beneath centuries of survival. Marriage didn't give her rest, but it gave her purpose, a structured, demanding, often beautiful rhythm of life that blended duty with resilience. And in that rhythm, she carved out her own form of quiet power. Marriage in the Middle Ages didn't just mark a personal commitment. It signaled a shift in standing. For a man, taking a wife meant stepping into a fuller role in the community. It was a sign he was no longer a boy, no longer just another set of hands in the field or on the forge. Now he was a provider, a protector, a name tied to a household. His daily rhythm started with the same gray light as his wife's, but his path often took him outward. If he was a peasant, his feet would already know the worn trail from cottage to field, through dew-covered grass, or mud thick with yesterday's rain. The soil he worked wasn't just his livelihood, it was his duty, passed from father to son, or leased from a lord who expected grain, labor, or coin in return. For tradesmen, the day began behind a shuttered stall or workshop. A blacksmith might stoke his fire while the village still slept. A cobbler or carpenter would sort tools, ready to fix boots or shape beams. These were jobs that built towns, quiet hands laying the frame for daily life. But whether he worked wood, leather, iron, or land, the unspoken pressure remained the same. Support your household, feed your family, be dependable. Marriage meant more mouths to feed, and often more quickly than expected. Children could come within months. If not, the neighbors noticed. A good harvest brought relief, a bad one brought fear. Droughts and illness didn't care how hard a man worked. Still, he was expected to shoulder the burden, often silently. But his role wasn't just about work. A married man became a figure of authority, not only within his home, but in the broader web of medieval life. He was expected to speak for his household at local gatherings, to pay dues, to appear when called upon by his lord or church. In disputes, he defended his family's name. In debts, he was the one held responsible. This authority could be a weight or a comfort. Some men wore it with kindness, others with harshness. The line between leadership and control was often thin, and rarely questioned in a time when tradition shaped every expectation. A husband's word carried force, both inside his home and out. That power could protect, or it could harm. Despite the demands, married life wasn't without its moments of warmth. A man might return from the fields to the smell of stew, or sit on a bench at twilight, listening to his wife hum a tune older than memory. There were shared cups of ale after market, quiet walks through the orchard, laughter over misbehaving geese or stubborn children. Affection often grew not from grand gestures, but from consistency. Showing up, doing the work, being present. Community was part of the rhythm. On feast days, the same hands that planted and repaired lifted mugs and played music. A married man might stand shoulder to shoulder with neighbors in celebration, just as he did during the lean months. These gatherings were more than distraction. They reinforced bonds, reminded him he wasn't alone. Still, dangers were never far. A bad storm could ruin crops. A minor illness could become fatal. War might call him away, or taxation bleed him dry. And in those moments, the quiet strength of his household, of his wife, his children, his kin, became more vital than ever. They weren't just dependents. They were a lifeline. There were men who ran from these pressures, who drank too much, struck out in anger, or abandoned what they couldn't carry, but most stayed. They plowed, hammered, hunted, bartered not for glory, but for the steady promise of enough. Enough to eat, enough to build, enough to endure. And when night came, he might sleep beside the same woman he'd once only known by name, now familiar by voice, by footsteps, by the way she sighed when the fire died low. It wasn't always love in the storybook sense. Love came later, or it didn't, but respect, loyalty, habit shaped into care, that, more often than not, grew with time. So, what was it like to be a married man in the Middle Ages? It was to wake up knowing the weight of others rested on your shoulders, to work with hands cracked from the cold, to try, fail, try again, to build something that might, with luck, last long enough to hand down. A life not carved in stone, but shaped in sweat, silence, and perseverance. In a world where survival was never guaranteed, few things carried more weight than the birth of a child. It was joy and fear tangled tightly together, a moment steeped in tradition, risk, and quiet prayers. For a medieval woman, pregnancy didn't come with soft linens or trained doctors. It came with swelling ankles, aching backs, and a growing awareness that every kick could be a promise or a warning. Some births ended with tears of relief, others with silence. Midwives were central to this world. They weren't just helpers. They were lifelines. Often older women who'd attended dozens, even hundreds of births. They carried practical knowledge in their hands and a calmness in their voice. They knew how to position a struggling baby, how to read a mother's pulse by touch, how to whisper prayers when things began to turn. In the absence of medicine, they were part healer, part protector, part anchor. Labor could last hours, sometimes days. In a home warmed by a single hearth, the walls might fill with the sounds of moaning, whispered encouragement, water boiling in iron pots. Herbs were steeped, cloths prepared, charms hung above doors or tucked under pillows. Faith was never far from the process. Saints were invoked, holy relics pressed to foreheads, and candles lit against the shadows. When the child finally arrived, there was no instant silence like in films or books. There was blood, crying, relief, and then, only then, celebration. A healthy baby was a gift, and also a responsibility. Baptism followed swiftly, often within a day or two, because infant mortality was high. The church taught that an unbaptized child's soul lingered outside salvation, and so no time was wasted. In many homes, the first walk the baby ever took, carried in swaddled arms, was to the parish font. Names held meaning. Children might be named after saints, grandparents, or the season of their birth. Some families believed certain names brought protection. Others reused the name of a recently lost sibling, passing hope down like a candle lit from a dying flame. But raising children in the Middle Ages was never easy. They were loved deeply, fiercely, but affection had to share space with pragmatism. Many wouldn't survive past childhood. Illness, famine, accident. Death was never far, and so parents learned to hold joy carefully, never taking it for granted. A child's laughter in the yard, their muddy feet on the floor. All were fleeting blessings. Still, the household revolved around them. Toddlers played with wooden toys, bits of fabric, or whatever they could find near the hearth. As soon as they could walk, they had tasks: feeding chickens, gathering herbs, fetching water. Childhood didn't stretch out the way it does now. It folded quickly into work and imitation. By 7 or 8, a child might already be expected to help in a trade. Boys apprenticed. Girls learned to spin, cook, and tend to siblings. Sons of farmers followed fathers into the fields. Daughters of merchants helped tally goods or carry bundles. Learning came not from books, but from repetition, watching hands move, copying until they got it right. And yet, even among the chores and early maturity, children found room for wonder. They chased geese, built pretend castles with stones, whispered secrets in corners. Their laughter echoed between timber walls or out over open meadows. Some things never change. Education, if it came at all, depended on wealth. In monasteries, some boys learned to read Latin, to write with care, to chant psalms by candlelight. A lucky few might study further, become scribes or scholars. But most children, especially girls, never touched parchment. Their lessons were in the rhythm of the seasons and how to survive a storm or cure a cough. Parents carried hopes quietly. A healthy child meant help in old age. A good match might raise the family standing. A clever son might escape the cycle of toil. But there were no guarantees. The world could turn fast. Still, through every risk, every sleepless night, parents tried. They carried their children through hunger, through winter, through grief. They sang lullabies in old dialects. They mended clothes again and again. They told stories by firelight, tales older than memory, planting courage in the hearts of the next generation. Because in the end, every life continued through the hands of children. In their steps, their stumbles, their laughter. They were the future, shaped by a past that asked much of them, and gave little in return but love, survival, and the chance to grow. In the Middle Ages, marriage was never just a private affair. It was a public, sacred contract sealed under the watchful eyes of the Church. Long before the vows were spoken, before rings exchanged hands, the Church shaped what marriage meant, who could marry, and how they should live together. For many, it was the center of both hope and pressure, faith and fear. At its heart, the Church saw marriage as a holy sacrament, a divine union ordained by God. The ceremony itself was filled with solemn rituals, prayers, blessings, the joining of hands, all meant to bind two souls as one under heaven's gaze. The priest's words echoed in the stone walls, promising unity, until death do us part. This was not just a promise between two people, but a vow before God, a sacred duty that shaped lives. Yet beneath the ceremony's grandeur lay a complex web of rules and expectations. The Church regulated marriage tightly. It forbade unions between close relatives, no matter how distant, and insisted on formal consent. A couple had to freely agree, though in practice, families often guided those decisions, negotiating alliances, wealth, and power. Marriage wasn't about romantic love the way we think of it now. It was about creating a stable household, producing heirs, and strengthening community ties. For the Church, love was a grace that might grow later, but duty came first. The Church's authority extended far beyond the wedding day. It governed how couples lived, how they resolved conflicts, and even how they could separate, if at all. Divorce, as we know, it didn't exist. Instead, the Church allowed annulments, but only under strict conditions, like proving the marriage was never valid due to hidden reasons such as prior vows or incapacity. Those who stepped outside these boundaries faced not just social scorn, but spiritual consequences. Adultery was a grave sin, punishable by penance, public humiliation, or worse. The fear of eternal damnation hovered over many marriages, binding couples together through both love and dread. Within the home, the Church's teachings shaped gender roles sharply. Husbands were considered the heads of their households, responsible for providing and protecting. Wives were expected to obey and manage the domestic realm. This arrangement wasn't merely social custom. It was framed as divine order, written into sermons and taught from pulpits. Yet, real life was messier. Some marriages found warmth in shared faith and companionship. Others endured hardship, silence, or cruelty. Still, the Church's presence was constant, a silent observer judging the bonds it had sanctified. Married couples were also tied into the rhythm of the Church's calendar. Feasts, fasts, and holy days marked the year, intertwining faith with daily life. Weddings themselves often coincided with saints' days or harvest seasons, blending celebration with the practical needs of a rural world. Marriage brought with it community obligations too. Couples were expected to attend Mass together, to baptize their children, to participate in parish life. In many villages, the Church was the center of social life, a place where marriages were announced, disputes settled, and families forged. Still, despite its rules and rituals, marriage could be a refuge. In a harsh and uncertain world, it offered a promise of partnership, a daily companion to share burdens and hopes. The sacred vows taken beneath that humble altar echoed far beyond the chapel doors. But the Church's gaze was never far, reminding couples of the stakes, the eternal consequences woven into every word spoken, every promise made. It was a reminder that marriage was more than a bond of two hearts. It was a covenant of faith, community, and destiny. In this way, medieval marriage was a quiet paradox, a source of profound hope, and deep constraint, a sacred union and a social contract, a blessing and a burden wrapped in one. And through it all, couples navigated their days, carrying the weight of vows both spoken and silent. Once the wedding celebrations faded and the prayers settled, married life in the Middle Ages settled into a rhythm both simple and demanding. It was a world where routine wasn't just habit, it was survival, a constant negotiation between roles, duties, and quiet moments shared in a home often far from comfortable. For most couples, the day began early. Before dawn, the husband rose to tend to fields, animals, or craftwork, depending on their station. His work was often harsh and unending, plowing, chopping wood, hauling grain. The weight of providing rested heavily on his shoulders, a responsibility measured not only in effort, but in how well his family could eat and stay warm. The wife, meanwhile, often began her day in the kitchen or by the hearth. Cooking was no simple task. Meals were made from what the earth and season could offer: coarse bread, salted meat, root vegetables, and occasionally something fresh from the garden. Food was prepared carefully, not just for nourishment, but to stretch scarce resources as far as possible. But her role wasn't limited to the kitchen. She was the household manager, the nurse, the teacher of children, and often the family's spiritual anchor. Mending clothes, churning butter, weaving cloth, all fell under her watchful eye. Her hands were never still, and her days were long, punctuated by a cycle of chores that left little time for rest. Despite the hard work, there was a shared life. Couples exchanged brief words over breakfast, maybe a touch or a smile when children weren't listening. They relied on each other, the husband on his wife's knowledge of the household, the wife on his protection and strength. This partnership wasn't always warm or easy, but it was essential. Their home was a tight space, often a single room where food was cooked, work done, and sleep taken. Privacy was rare, walls were thin, and noise was constant. The smells of animals, smoke, and sweat mingled with the scent of cooking herbs and damp earth. It was not a quiet refuge, but it was home. Religious practice continued to weave through daily life. Prayers were said at morning and night, blessings given over meals, and saints invoked for protection. Sundays brought the community together at church, a brief pause from labor, and a chance to renew faith and social ties. Disagreements were common, as in any marriage. Arguments over money, work, or children could flare. But in a world where divorce was almost impossible, couples learned to navigate tensions with resilience. Sometimes, silence was the only truce. Other times, the pressure of their shared life forged a deeper understanding. Children, too, shaped daily rhythms. The wife's attention often divided between household tasks and tending to sick or crying little ones. Fathers, when home, played a role in teaching and discipline. Every day was a balancing act of care and work, love and duty. Occasionally, celebrations or fairs broke the monotony. A wedding, a feast day, a market visit. These moments brought color and laughter, but also reminded couples of their place in a larger world governed by tradition and hierarchy. Night brought a different quiet, but not always peace. The cold stone or packed earth beneath them reminded them of the hard life they led. Still, they found comfort in the warmth of shared blankets, the steady breathing of loved ones beside them. Through all this, marriage was less about romance and more about partnership. A continuous, sometimes grueling dance of survival, faith, and mutual support. It was a world shaped by necessity, where love could grow quietly in the spaces between chores and prayers. This life might seem distant now, harsh even, but it was real, a testament to human endurance and the small moments of connection that made it bearable. The daily life of a married couple was woven from routine and resilience, prayer and practicality, hardship and hope. And it was within these ordinary days that the true story of medieval marriage was written. Far from the castles and legends, in the humble homes where love, in all its forms, quietly endured. In the Middle Ages, marriage was often spoken of as "till death do us part." But death wasn't a distant thought. It was an ever-present shadow hovering over couples from the very start. Life was fragile, illness and accidents frequent, And the gap between marriage's hopeful beginning and its final chapter could be heartbreakingly short. When a spouse fell ill, the whole household felt the tremors of uncertainty. There were no modern medicines, no hospitals as we know them, only herbal remedies, prayers, and the gentle hands of family members. The church offered comfort and rites, preparing souls for the journey beyond, while loved ones faced the looming reality with quiet dread. The death of a partner was a rupture not just emotional, but practical. Suddenly, the surviving spouse faced immense challenges. Widows and widowers often had to navigate their place in a world where identity was tightly bound to marriage. For women especially, loss could mean insecurity or dependence, though some found ways to assert new forms of independence, managing estates, or remarrying to secure their future. Beyond personal grief, death carried with it questions of inheritance and legacy. Medieval marriage was not only a union of hearts, but of property and bloodlines. The birth of children, especially sons, was crucial for passing on family wealth, land, and titles. Without heirs, families risked losing everything, and the pressure to produce offspring was immense. When a spouse died, estates could be divided or contested. The legal and social frameworks were often complicated, favoring male heirs, but offering widows some protections, dower rights that allowed them to live on a portion of their husband's lands for support. These arrangements shaped family dynamics long after the funeral candles burned out. Funerals themselves were deeply communal events, blending sorrow with ceremony. The church played a central role in marking the passage, with prayers for the soul's peace and hopes for reunion in the afterlife. Mourning periods were observed, with widows often donning black and retreating from public life, a visible sign of loss and respect. Yet, even in death, marriage's influence lingered. Widows and widowers carried the weight of vows made years before, and the memories of shared struggles and joys. The past shaped their futures, guiding decisions about remarriage, household management, or raising children alone. For some, the end of a marriage meant a new beginning. Widows frequently remarried, sometimes multiple times, navigating the complex social webs of alliances and survival. These subsequent marriages could offer stability, security, or new hope, though they also meant adapting to new roles and relationships. In the grand sweep of history, marriages left marks far beyond their lifetimes, through descendants who carried family names and traditions, through land passed down and stories told. Medieval marriage was a thread woven into the fabric of community, faith, and survival, extending beyond the living to echo through generations. And so as one marriage ended, another life continued, shaped by the past, of looking forward, bound by vows and memories. Forever part of a cycle that linked the living to those who came before and those yet to come. In the quiet after the last breath, marriage's true legacy wasn't just in contracts or ceremonies. It was in the enduring human spirit, the resilience to love, to lose, and to begin again. So here we are, at the end of our journey through the world of medieval marriage. A world so far from the fairy tales of knights and princesses, yet rich with its own complex beauty and struggle. We've walked beside couples who faced challenges that today might seem unimaginable. The weight of obligation, the harshness of daily life, and the ever-present shadow of uncertainty. Marriage was rarely about romantic love as we think of it now. Instead, it was a pact forged by necessity, by duty, by faith, and sometimes by hope. What struck me most as we traveled back in time is how deeply human it all was. Behind the simple wooden doors and heavy stone walls, there were people just like us, with dreams and fears, laughter and tears. They found ways to connect amid hardship, to build families amid chaos, and to hold on to each other when everything else felt like it might fall apart. Their love wasn't always easy or grand. It was often quiet, practical, and sometimes painful. But it was real. It was about survival. Yes, but also about partnership. It was about creating something lasting in a world where nothing could be taken for granted. And perhaps that's the greatest lesson this chapter of history offers us. That love, in all its imperfect forms, is timeless. That even in the darkest times, people find ways to care for one another, to build homes, to raise children, and to carry on. So as you drift off tonight, think of those couples from centuries ago, the everyday heroes of a different age. Their stories remind us that marriage is never just about a ceremony or a promise. It's about the countless small moments that weave together to make a life. Thank you for sharing this journey with me. If you enjoyed this look at what it really meant to get married in the Middle Ages, feel free to like, subscribe, or leave a comment about what part surprised or moved you most. And wherever you are, whatever time it is, I hope you rest well, knowing that across time, we all share the same hopes for love, connection, and belonging. Good night, and until next time.